Deuteronomy chapter 20, we have got to, I have got to get moving on it because we were cut short on time in the first service. And so let me share Deuteronomy chapter 20 with you. And this is wisdom for warfare. Wisdom for warfare. And you can see it's broken into 5 main divisions, is what I call them, 5 main divisions. And we are not going to cover all of these. We're going to cover certain sections. Others I will just give you an idea of, summarize them for you. But the first one, preparing spiritually, that one we will spend some time in, okay, when we open up here in just a minute. Picking soldiers, we will not, but I'll explain to you what it is when we get there. Peace offering, that's another one we'll look in a little bit deeper, a little bit closer. And protecting themselves, that one we'll look at a little bit closer also. The last one, protecting natural resources, is just, you come across these passages sometimes in the Bible where they're just funny or odd. And I mean, as we go through Deuteronomy, there's probably a lot of those for you. But this one in particular, protecting natural resources, shows us that God was concerned about the trees. A strange thing. That's not something that we often think about, especially in our Christian circles. You know, we kind of see that as, oh, trees, nature, that's for tree huggers or whatever. But we see that Moses is giving instructions because there's some wisdom there in dealing with the trees. What a strange thing. But all of these 5 different main divisions have to do with warfare. Okay? And we'll see that right from the beginning. Let's go ahead and get into our first section, which is the preparing for warfare section, or preparing spiritually, as you can see. And this is going to take us from verses 1 down to verse 4. But we see immediately the need for this wisdom, because in verse 1, it begins with the W word, and that is when. Let me go on and read it. When you go out to battle against your enemies. When you go out. He does not use the word if. If you go out. If this should happen. It's a when. It's an absolute. It's not a what if. Now, keep in mind that as you and I go through Deuteronomy, we're looking or reading through a document that is thousands, literally thousands of years old. And we might ask ourselves as we approach it, how can this document have anything applicable to my life today in 2023? And certainly for the majority of us, we're never going to face battle this way. When you go out to battle against your enemies, we would not do that. Now, there may be some of us that are going into the military, and you may actually find yourself in that position of going out for warfare, in which case much of this would apply even more so. But let me explain to you how this affects all of us, at least all of us that are Christians. Any Christian is going to experience spiritual warfare. All of us are going to experience warfare. Spiritual warfare most commonly. Now, what do we mean by spiritual warfare? Well, we will in a few minutes, not right now, we will go to Ephesians. And what you will find today is that we're going to jump to, we're going to be reading through Deuteronomy. We will go over to Ephesians for a few minutes and read a passage. We'll come back to Deuteronomy, look at it some more. And then we'll go back to Ephesians and look at some more. We'll come back to Deuteronomy. We'll go back to Ephesians one more time. So there's lots to cover here, and we'll try to keep it moving fast so that it's not, or not necessarily fast, but just keep it moving so that we not get bogged down. But we'll find out in the letter to the Ephesians that all of us are involved in spiritual warfare. Now, what does that look like? And what does that mean? Is that like, man, is that like an exorcism? Is that spiritual warfare? And is it going to look like the movie? And, is someone's head going to spin around, or is my head going to spin around? Like, what does that look like? All of us are going to experience spiritual warfare. I actually have no problem saying to you that if you've been a Christian for any length of time, you have actually already experienced spiritual warfare. You may just have not known that it was actually spiritual warfare. Spiritual warfare most often comes through earthly situations. Let me give you one. I'm just making these up, okay? But these are things that happen to all of us. Some kind of conflict. You think about it, all of our conflicts have to do with people. In different scenarios, different degrees. But a conflict you may have had, that might have been with a parent. Might have been with a sibling. Could have been with a teacher. Could have been with a classmate, another student. Could have been someone on your team. Could have been someone in your neighborhood. Could have been someone at the store. Some situation with somebody else where there's some kind of conflict, some kind of conflict. And here's the spiritual. Now that's not the spiritual warfare part. Everybody has those. Everybody, gets into some kind of disagreement with other people. That always happens. The spiritual warfare part comes in how I deal with that situation, that disagreement. Because what can often happen, and you'll as I share these things, you'll go, yeah, that's absolutely true. What can oftentimes happen is if you are having a conflict with someone, whether it be a parent or a friend or whoever it might be, there are emotions and different thoughts and feelings that go along with that. But what can happen is being in that kind of a situation, you might respond in anger. You might get really mad and get angry. You might become fearful at the thought of conflict. It might be the conflict might come in the form of a big decision that you have to make. Maybe there's something going on in your life and there's a decision that needs to be made and you're fearful of that. That is when the spiritual warfare part comes in, is in how I respond. Do I respond in a Christ-like manner, or do I respond in a Chris-like manner? There's a difference. A Christ-like manner is going to respond accordingly. It might be lovingly, it might be graciously, it might be mercifully. A Chris-like response is probably going to be selfish. And that might result in anger. It might result in, physical conflict. It could result in lots of different things. But that is where that's where the spiritual warfare part comes in. And maybe you just didn't realize. Now, let me tell you what happens. And please understand that I'm not trying to downplay anything that goes on in your life. But oftentimes you can think that because you're nervous or scared or fearful of something, you can chalk that up to anxiety. Okay, that's a word that lots of people use, anxiety. And I'm not saying it's not. But what you can do is you could say, well, it's just my anxiety. Maybe you think, well, I've got social anxiety, or I've got, I've got anxiety about this situation. But what happens is that oftentimes, and I would say that that's where the spiritual warfare part comes in. How am I responding to this? Am I fearful? Am I, what am I doing here? And the anxiousness sets in. The Bible actually talks about anxiousness. But what happens oftentimes is I try to fix that spiritual problem using earthly methods. It might be breathing techniques. It might be medication. It might be, some form of therapy or whatever. Lots of different things that people do to try to deal with their anxiety. However, biblically, what we find out is that, and from Paul in Philippians, is that when we are experiencing anxiety, there's actually a spiritual way to go about that. So there's the spiritual warfare part. How am I responding to this situation? Am I fearful? Am I faithful? Am I angry? Am I gracious? What am I? And so as you and I are reading through these instructions to the Israelites as they consider their future warfare, you and I are going to find application for how it corresponds to us, how it applies to us through spiritual warfare. And we'll find some things out today. And so that's why, in a few minutes, I'll let you know when we'll go to Ephesians. And we'll look at some very, very helpful things there as it pertains to spiritual warfare. But let's read on. When you go out to battle against your enemies, when, not if, and you see horses and chariots and people more numerous than you, do not be afraid of them. Now, these always crack me up when I come to them in the Bible. Do not be afraid. Because whenever somebody's being told not to be afraid in the Bible, there's every reason to be afraid. And this one's no different. And we just told them, this is Moses. Here's Moses' pep talk. He says, listen, when you're going to be involved in battle, when that happens, you're going to see three things. You're going to see horses. Okay? Now, the Israelites did not have horses. They had donkeys that they might have traveled on. They had cows. They had flocks, goats, sheep, different animals. but they didn't have horses for warfare. The second thing that he mentions is chariots. They most certainly did not have these. Everybody knows what a chariot is. It would be pulled by a horse. Very, very effective in warfare because you could move very, very quickly, maneuver very quickly, and you could run people over with your chariot. So it was always very effective. The Israelites did not have chariots. And then the third thing that he mentions is that you will see people more numerous than you. So that's already been established. You may remember in a previous chapter, the Israelites, in planning on going into the land of Canaan, they came back and they said, hey, they're fortified cities, they've got walls built up to the heavens, and there are way too many people. Now, this is one of those funny pep talks. This would be the equivalent of you gathering with your basketball team or your soccer team, football team, or whatever, and the coach gathers you all up. It says, all right, guys, all right, ladies, let's gather up. Here's the game plan. This other team that you're about to play is way better than you. They're faster, they're stronger, they're smarter, they can score easier, and there's more of them. They got more subs. You ever get in that situation where you look at your team and your team's kind of small, you're looking at the sub bench like, man, you got like, 2 people over there. You look at the other team and it's like they got like a whole nother team over there. That's the equivalent here. Moses is telling them, listen, you're going to go into battle, and I just want you to know that the people over there that you're going up against, they've got way better resources, they've got money, they've got better training, there's more of them, they're stronger, they're faster, and there's every reason to fear for your life. And then he tells them, do not be afraid of them. It's like, how am I supposed to not be afraid of them? Now, this happens to us in a spiritual sense. This happens all the time. We come up against situations that I cannot handle. Who can handle the news that one of your loved ones has been diagnosed with cancer? Or that parents are separating or divorcing? Those are things that overwhelm us. They overwhelm our minds and our hearts. Those are things, we look at that and we go, what am I supposed to do? How do I fix this? There's nothing I can do about it. And you find yourself oftentimes in those situations becoming hopeless because you realize that you can't do anything about it. That's what they were facing. Horses, chariots, and more people than they had. And yet, he tells them, do not be afraid of them. Why would I not be afraid of them? Well, notice the next word in verse 1 is a small 3-letter word. It's for, F-O-R. Now, that word for means because. He says, do not be afraid of them because, number 1, the Lord your God is with you. Now, here's what he's telling them here. The first thing, here's our first subpoint for this section. Verse 1, remember the Lord. That's what he's telling them. Remember the Lord, for the Lord your God. The first thing he does is, when they realize that they are outmatched, as he says, okay, you're outmatched, what should you do? Step number one, remember the Lord. Same thing for me. When I find myself in the middle of a spiritual battle and I find myself outmatched, the first thing I want to do is remember the Lord. Wait a minute, I'm not in this, and here's what he tells us about remembering the Lord. He says, don't forget that the Lord is with you. He says, for the Lord your God is with you. Now, the title Lord your God would indicate or remind them of the sovereignty of God. He's the Lord. He's uppercase G, capital G, God. In other words, he's sovereign over all other enemies, armies, all other so-called gods. His sovereignty. But what you want to remember about that is his presence. And that's what he tells them, for the Lord your God is with you. In other words, the Lord your God is not with your enemy. He's with you. Now, you want to keep that in mind. What we are going to find out when we go to Ephesians in a few minutes is that we are fighting a spiritual battle. And the enemy that we are fighting against is way more powerful than you and I. Apart from God, there's no way for us to combat our spiritual enemy. So in that situation, what do I want to do? I want to remember that God is with me and not with my enemy, my spiritual enemy. He says, for the Lord your God is with you. The next thing that he tells them is, who brought you up from the land of Egypt? It is always good to remember the past and what God has done in his faithfulness. Now, what can oftentimes happen is we go, you know what? I do not really see, where has God really been? What has he really done for me? Well, you may not have experienced great spiritual successes in your life. You may feel like, well, I haven't really seen God, he's not performed any miracles or anything like that. But there are still ways to look back and see God's faithfulness. Okay? Let me share with you a couple of those ways, a couple of very practical things. When you find yourself in a situation where you're feeling like, you know what, I'm overwhelmed, I can't handle this. God, where are you? God is there. You go, well, how do I know he's there? Well, look back at your life. Here's a couple of practical things. You have never really starved to death. And we say that. What that means, when we say I'm starving to death, what that means is there are no more Hot Pockets in the fridge for me to nuke in 30 seconds and eat. What that means is I'm starving to death, and you look in the fridge and you go, oh, there's no pizza, there's just mom's pot roast. Oh, I'm starving, I'm not eating that. That's what we mean. None of us has ever really starved to death. In fact, I would venture to say that the majority of us have never, ever gone a day without eating at least one meal. Most of the time, we eat multiple meals a day. Now, where does that come from? Well, it comes from my parents. They buy it. It comes from Costco, right? Maybe it does come from Costco. No doubt your parents paid for it. But how do they even have where did they get the money from? Where do they have the ability to even work? You see, God has been faithful in providing for you to sustain you all of your long 15, 16, 17, 18 years. Want another one? I'll give it to you anyways. Listen, you have never gone anywhere naked since you were a little baby, and your parents would embarrassingly take you out somewhere and change you in the middle of Disneyland, and just show your hindquarters to every passerby. But the truth is that as you look back at your life, look at your life right now, all of you are well dressed. You probably can go home, and you probably, even this morning, you probably opened up your closet, and you may have exclaimed, I've got nothing to wear. That is not true. You had your choice of things. Now, you may not have liked what was in there. It may not have been, weather appropriate or whatever, or you didn't like the colors or whatever, but you had clothing. In fact, you probably have a closet full of clothing. Some of you probably had your choice of shoes this morning. Probably had your choice of socks this morning. I have been to places, some within driving distance of where I'm standing now. I've been down to Mexico many, many years, many, many times. I have seen little kids with no shoes, no socks, and barely any clothing on. I still remember one young lady there in Las Brisas. It's a work camp, and she came to get some free food from us, and she had no socks, no shoes, and it's right on the ocean, and it was freezing. We were all in our jackets and sweatshirts, and she just walked up, little tiny thing, messed up hair, barely a shirt on, barely some shorts on. That's all she had. That's it. And one of our team members in fact, it was my sister, gave her sweatshirt, took off her sweatshirt, gave it to the little girl. We found the little girl. She no longer had the sweatshirt. She had taken the sweatshirt off and given it to her little sister, who was even younger than her. I've seen it. I'd venture to say that you probably have never experienced that in your life, in your own life. There's probably never been a time where you didn't have a choice of things. But what's funny is when this coming Thursday, when we sit down at the dinner table, Thanksgiving, and you know how mom is or grandma or whoever, they're like, okay, this is torturous. Before we eat, let's all go around the table and say what we're thankful for. That kills me. It's like, okay, all the food is piping hot. Turkey, mashed potatoes, gravy, mac and cheese. It's all here. And now you want me to wait 20 minutes while everybody tells us what they're thankful for? It's like, can't we just do that after? Can't we just do that out? Can't we eat and talk about what we're happy for? But here's the thing, or what we're thankful for. But let me say something to you. When that happens, I would bet that up until now, you probably have never gone, you know what, I just really want to thank the Lord for providing socks for me. Lord, I'm just really thankful that you've always provided clothes. Lord, I'm thankful that anytime I want, I can get some top ramen. Those are not things that we're thankful for. You know why? Because we take those things for granted. We assume that, well, these are just things that everybody gets. It's not true. Those are things that you have had all of your life. And you just thought everybody had it. It's not true. It's absolutely not true. But what I'm doing is I'm showing you that we oftentimes are unthankful for those little things, but we can look back and go, man, you know what? I've always had this stuff. I've always had these things. I've always had, a roof over my head, and maybe you don't like the roof over you. Maybe you don't like your house or your room. Or you don't like, I don't know. Like, I don't know why my parents have to have such a big car. It's so embarrassing or whatever. Yeah, but you guys have got a car. And those are things that we take for granted. We go, oh, what's the big deal? But these are things that are indicators of God's faithfulness. God's faithfulness. And so you and I can look back in the middle of those spiritually straining times, that warfare, and go, you know what? God is with me. And in fact, he always has been, because I've always had. He's always provided for me. Some of you may have other things that you look back on and go, no, I prayed for this and he answered my prayer in the positive. But this is what we want to do. Now, in verses 2 through 4, what he does is he tells them, hey, listen, when the time comes, here's what's going to happen. And he gives them the rundown. Verse 2, so it shall be when you are on the verge of battle, that the priest shall approach and speak to the people. And he shall say to them, hear, O Israel, Shema Israel. Today you are on the verge of battle with your enemies. And then he says, do not let your heart faint. Do not be afraid. And do not tremble or be terrified because of them. For the Lord your God is he who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to save you. Now, we read through that very quickly and we just brush it aside. Okay, what's the next one? Let's go. We got other things to cover. Did you hear what he said? He said in verse 4, for the Lord your God is he who goes with you to do what? To fight for you. We do not oftentimes envision God that way, as God fighting. And yet, throughout the Bible, and especially in the Old Testament, we have seen oftentimes where God fought with somebody. Now, let me share a couple of verses that are some of my favorites that remind me of this fact. Exodus 15:3, okay? Picture this. Moses has just come through the Red Sea. He just led 1 million people or so, maybe it was millions, through the Red Sea on dry ground. Miraculously, the water splits open and stands on end so that the people can get through. The Egyptian army begins to chase them down. God closes the waters back up, drowns the Egyptian military. What does Moses do? Moses immediately becomes Pentecostal, begins to worship and sing. And one of the things that he says is in Exodus 15:3, the Lord, he declares this, the Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. The Lord is a man of war? I've heard that the Lord is gracious and merciful, that he's loving, that he's forgiving, that he's patient, that he's kind, long-suffering. I've heard all kinds of things about the Lord. Never heard this. The Lord is a man of war? But let me explain to you how handy this can be. Imagine your parents are arguing, fighting, talking about separation, talking about divorce. What do you need? What you need is somebody to come and fight for your family. You need somebody to step in and fight on behalf of your family. Not fight your family, not fight for your mom or fight for your dad, but to fight for your family. The enemy's getting in there, putting a division between your parents. What you need is a man of war. Who better than the Lord? The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. Now, there's another one that I love from Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 14. I love the book of Nehemiah. Eventually, we will get there in like 15 years. And I looked, he says, and rose, and said to the nobles, to the leaders, and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them, he says. Do not be afraid of them. They were actually being threatened. While they were trying to rebuild a wall, they're being threatened by their enemies. Tobiah and some cat named Gashmu, Sanballat, okay? And so Nehemiah says, listen, I looked and rose and said to the nobles, to the leaders, and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. What's the next phrase? Remember the Lord, great and awesome. He's doing the same thing. Nehemiah is saying, listen, remember the Lord, great and awesome. Now, he doesn't say that the Lord is going to fight for you, but no doubt that's what he's saying. Remember the Lord, great and awesome. And fight for your sons, your daughters, your wives, your houses. You got to remember the Lord. If I'm going into battle, I remember that, that's right, the Lord's with me, and the Lord has been faithful. Let's turn to Ephesians chapter 6. I told you we're going to jump back and forth a little bit. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 6, and we'll pick it up at verse 10. Ephesians 6:10. I'll give you a second to get there, because before we leave this section, I want to show you what our spiritual warfare looks like. And we get a pretty good picture here. Doesn't have anything to do with exorcisms and heads spinning around and demonic voices coming out of somebody, or some haunted doll, chasing me down the hallway, from the bathroom at night, all those things that we imagine. It's like, I really got to go to the bathroom, but I really don't want to get up because my sister's doll is evil and it's in there and it might chase me back to my bed. What does this spiritual warfare look like? Ephesians chapter 6, Paul gives us some description of it, and he tells us what to do. Now, this is really neat, because in January, those of you that come on Wednesday nights, we will be starting the book of Ephesians. So we'll be in the book of Ephesians. It's chapter 6, so we may not get to chapter 6 until January of 25, but we're starting the book of Ephesians. But he says this in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 10. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. So he's going to tell us something that is going to help us be effective against the attacks of the devil. So we're talking about dealing with the devil here. Like, really? I don't know if you realize this, but the devil is way more powerful than you and I on our own. Now, when we've got the Lord, it's a different story. But you're expecting me to deal with the devil? Like, come on. Well, he goes on to say this in verse 12. He says, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood. The word wrestle means contend or fight. We're not fighting against flesh and blood. What Paul has just pointed out is that our fight as Christians is not against people. People are not the enemy. People are not the enemy. People may be motivated by the enemy. They may represent the enemy, but people are not the enemy. And so I don't want to waste my time fighting flesh and blood. There may be times where you have to defend yourself against somebody. But generally speaking, I don't want to waste my time fighting somebody. Let me get in an argument, or let me get into a boxing match with somebody, and that'll fix the problem, because that's not going to fix the problem. He says, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood. And then there are two key words that come right after that. And the word is but. Second one is against. But against. So what he's just done is he said, listen, we don't fight. Our enemy is not flesh and blood. We're not fighting against flesh and blood. But against means, however, we do have an enemy and we do fight. It's just not against flesh and blood. What is it against? Well, he mentions there are principalities. That's not your principal. Okay? Maybe you don't like your principal at school. That's not what he's talking about. He's like, oh, I can fight my principal. No. Principalities, you'll get the picture here, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age. Now, I was okay with principalities. Now, I don't really understand what that is. Against powers, okay. I'm not really sure what that means. I know what power means, but against powers. But what is this rulers of the darkness of this age? What is that all about? Is that like a Sith? Is that like those scary monsters in Lord of the Rings? What does this mean? Does this mean like demonic? Does this mean some demonic, some demon from the pit of hell? What are we talking about here? Yes, he's talking about spiritual forces. principalities, powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. By saying the heavenly places, that phrase means they're in the spiritual realm. There is a spiritual realm all around us that you and I cannot see. And within that spiritual realm, there is a spiritual battle taking place. That, within that realm, is where you and I are involved in battle. Now we get back to where we first started when we talked about, when we find ourselves in an earthly, physical battle with something, and I'm struggling like, I don't want to be afraid, but I'm really afraid. That's what's happening. Is that the enemy oftentimes is using these physical, earthly situations to attack me spiritually. So the physical, earthly situation that's not really the big problem. The big problem is, or the big battle is, what am I doing spiritually to affect this earthly situation? How am I responding to that? That's where the spiritual part comes in. And so he's explaining that all of us as Christians, we are involved in a spiritual battle. Verse 13, therefore, what do we do about it? Therefore, take up the whole armor of God that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all to stand. Now what he does is, Paul, he attributes spiritual attributes to a soldier's armor. He says in verse 14, stand therefore, having girded your waist with truth. Okay? So what do we need in the heat of the spiritual battle? We need truth. Having put on the breastplate of righteousness. So we need righteousness. What else do we need? Verse 15, and having shod your feet with the preparation of the gospel of peace. We need peace. Verse 16, above all, taking the shield of faith. So we need faith. With which you will be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked one. So spiritually speaking, the wicked one, Satan or his demons, are launching fiery darts or fiery arrows at us, waging war against us. Verse 17, take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which he explains is the Word of God. So I need the Word of God to deal with these things. And these are all defensive. Look at verse 18, praying always. Finally, the offensive weapons, prayer. Praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, watchful to this end with all perseverance and supplication for all the saints. In a nutshell, you got to pray. It's part of the battle wear there. You got to go on the attack. You got to have a shield of faith, sword of the Spirit. You got to pray. All of those different things. But the point is that you and I are involved in spiritual warfare. But there is something that we can do about it. There is a way for us to prepare. The way for us to prepare begins with remembering the Lord, remembering that He's with me, and remember His faithfulness from the past. Now, let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 20. And as you can see, I'm picking it up at verse 10. And you go, well, hey, what happened with verses 5 through 9? We're not going to cover those. I will just give them to you in a nutshell, summarize them for you. Basically, in verses 5 through 9, God is actually giving allowances for people not to go to battle. He says, listen, man, if you're engaged, newly engaged, he says, don't go to battle. If you just built a house, don't go to battle. If you just planted your field, don't go to battle. And then he actually says, if you're just afraid, don't go to battle. The reason being is he wants soldiers that are focused and not distracted by other things. If somebody's afraid, that could affect other people. You know how that works, right? You may not have a problem with walking down your hallway at night until your cousin tells you a story that he or she heard about on YouTube about some man-eating monster that comes out of the light bulbs in the hallways and kills people, and all of a sudden you've got that in your mind and you find yourself running down the hallway back and forth, so you can get to your room or whatever. So oftentimes our fear can be stirred up by someone else, and he says, listen, if you're afraid, just don't go to battle. God did not need everybody there. God could do it with 1,000, he could do it with 100, he could do it with 1, he could do it with none. He'd done it. But They're saying, pick the army wisely, basically. But in verses 10 through 15, what we get is another area that we'll slow down at, and this is a peace offering. I'll tell you why it's a special passage. But let's read in verse 10. When you go near a city to fight against it, then proclaim an offer of peace to it. See what God did there? God said, when you go to fight somebody else, you go to battle with someone else, offer peace. Okay? In verses 10 and 11, we find out what happens if they accept. Verse 11, and it shall be that if they accept your offer of peace and open to you, then all the people who are found in it shall be placed under tribute to you and serve you. So they'll have to answer to the Israelites. But they'll survive. They'll live. Now in verses 12 through 15, he tells them what happens if they reject. And essentially what he says there is that if they reject, then everybody needs to be destroyed in that city. Not everybody, all the men of war, all of the soldiers. But why? Here's why. Verse 15. Thus you shall do to all the cities which, verse 15. I'm getting my thoughts mixed up. Let me back up a little bit. Verse 15. Thus you shall do to all the cities which are very far from you, which are not of the cities of these nations. Now let me tell you, there's a difference here. He's giving these instructions for warfare outside of the promised land. He makes it clear there at the end, but in the land of Canaan, everybody needs to be destroyed. Now, those of you that might be new to our study, you might wonder, well, why would he want everybody in the land of Canaan destroyed? Well, you'd have to go back. He does tell us in previous chapters why. But because the people in the land were wicked. And don't think that God just decided this overnight. I don't like those people, I'm getting rid of them. They had been allowed, the Canaanites had been allowed to conduct business for hundreds of years. But within that time, they had introduced all sorts of wicked practices. But the one I always like to bring up, because it gives you a good example of how wicked the people were, was the sacrificing of their babies to the god Molech, where they would heat up these metal arms that were sitting out in front of the statue this way. They would heat them up, metal arms, and then they would place their babies on those metal arms and kill the babies, cook the babies to death. So that was just a taste of what the Canaanites were doing. There was much more that they were involved in. However, here what he's saying, he's given instructions for when they go to battle against other nations outside of the land of Canaan. But this idea of a peace offering is a wonderful thing. I told you we were going to jump back and forth between Deuteronomy and Ephesians. Let's go back to Ephesians chapter 2. Ephesians chapter 2. And let me show you how this applies to us and the peace offering that God extended to you and I and still extends to everybody. Ephesians chapter 2 will give us some insight into this. And what we will do, let me see. What we will do is we'll go to Ephesians 2:11. Ephesians 2:11. I'll cut it a little bit shorter than I did in the first service because, again, we ran short on time. Ephesians 2:11. He says, therefore remember that you, once Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by what is called the circumcision made made in the flesh by hand. What he's explaining is these people were separate from God. That at that time you were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who once were afar off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. You see, Jesus is God's peace offering to us. Verse 14, for he himself is our peace, who has made both one and has broken down the middle wall of separation. If you're in Ephesians 2, go to verse 17. And he came and preached peace to you who were afar off and to those who were near. Verse 19, now therefore you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. So Paul there in Ephesians explains how this idea of a peace offering is still being offered by God today through Jesus. When God sent Jesus to this earth, we're about to come up on the celebration of his birth in December here, Christmas. But when God sent his son Jesus, it wasn't just to come and defeat Satan or just to come and accomplish other things. There were lots of things that he accomplished. But generally speaking, what God was doing is he was offering peace to the world. That's why so many of our Christmas carols are about peace being offered to the world. Because we were at enmity, or we were enemies with God, and then God offered peace, and we, those of us that are Christians in here today, we went, oh yeah, I need that. I need that. Now you may have been 5 years old when you got saved. Maybe you just got saved 2 months ago or last week. And you're young, but still, there was a time when you were an enemy of God, and God offered to you peace through Jesus, and you accepted. So God is still offering peace to the world, really. Now let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 20, and we will pick up our next section, which is verses 16 through 18, where Moses is giving them some wisdom for warfare, and he tells them this, verse 16 through 18. He says in verse 16, but of the cities of these people, the Canaanites, which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance, you shall let nothing that breathes remain alive. Why? Why did God want everybody destroyed within the land of Canaan? Verse 18. Lest they teach you to do according to all their abominations which they have done for their gods, and you sin against the Lord your God. So he's telling them, you need to completely eliminate the danger. Get rid of everyone, because if you do not, they're going to teach you their bad ways. And guess what? Eventually, the Israelites ended up adopting the worship practices of the Canaanites, even going so far as to sacrifice their own children. The Israelites, God's people, they did the same exact thing. What Moses was warning them about, they did not heed the warning, and they ended up doing the same things. You can read about it in your history books. It's common knowledge. They didn't listen. But the point here is to eliminate the danger completely. Now, let me explain something to you. We're in November. We've got Thanksgiving coming up. We've only got like a week and a half left of November. So that means December's coming, then January. How's it going with your New Year's resolutions? I mean the ones from this year that you were starting on January 1st. Remember those? Are you, right now, November, coming up on the end of the year, are you as buff as you imagined yourself being last December when you were making your New Year's resolution? Let me ask you another question. Did you lose as much weight as you imagined yourself doing last December? Or you're like, I probably should just do a redo this in 2024. Here's what happens is that you and I oftentimes we may have these thoughts and like, man, I want to do this. I'm gonna really make some gains, man. Or I'm gonna cut down, and I'm gonna just really slim. I'm gonna be looking good, man. I'm gonna be fit. I'm going to the gym like every day. But then that doesn't happen. For lots of different reasons, but one of the major reasons is because we are not willing to eliminate the danger. I really, really want to lose weight, but I really love tacos. I really want to cut down and lose some weight. I want to get slim, man. I want to get trim. I want to be fit, but I really like hot Cheetos and tea. Come on. Or I really want to I want to get buff. I want to get six-pack. I want to get buff. But I really don't want to stop eating top ramen. I don't really like eating salads. You can't get those things without removing the temptation completely, eliminating the danger. Hot Cheetos, obese teas, eliminate the danger. If you really want to make a difference, you got to change the diet, man. You got to change what's going in. But see, we don't eliminate the danger. So then what happens is it just comes back. I may get rid of it for a couple days, maybe a week, maybe a month, man. I'm doing good. But then somebody's like, hey, hot Cheetos, girl, you ain't had them in a long time. You're like, maybe just one. One goes to two, two goes to 10, 10 goes to your own bag, right? You know how it goes. In order for us to progress, you've got to eliminate the danger. Here he tells them you've got to eliminate the danger lest they teach you to do according to all your abominations. The Bible, this biblical principle, the Bible has a lot to say about it. Philippians 3:13, Paul says this, brethren, I do not count myself to have apprehended. I've not gotten there yet. But one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind. So eliminating the danger, forgetting those things which are behind, things that are holding me back, and reaching forward to those things which are ahead. In Romans chapter 6, I didn't make a slide because there's several verses. Let me read to you what Paul says there. Likewise, you also reckon yourselves to be dead indeed to sin. So cut it off, eliminate the danger. But alive to God in Christ Jesus our Lord. Therefore, do not let sin reign in your mortal body, that you should obey it in its lusts. Cut it off. And do not present your members as instruments of unrighteousness to sin. There it is. Cut it off. But present yourselves as to God as being alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness to God. So that principle of eliminating the danger. You want to progress, you want to move forward, you got to cut things out and not just let them linger, kind of hang out. Okay? If you know somebody's having a bad influence on you, what do you need to do? You might have to cut them off and say, no, I can't handle it. I don't do well with that kind of an influence. And you know what? All of us are influenced by people daily. I'd be willing to bet that your style, your fashion, the things that you wear, probably you've seen those things on somebody else and thought, oh, that looks cute or that looks cool or whatever. And you know what? Yeah, no, I want some of that. We generally speaking, we look like everybody else. I'm talking about our fashion. Everybody that's inside the sanctuary. And if you and I were to go to the mall after church today, we'd probably look a lot like everybody else in the style of clothes that we wear, the choice of, colors or, pants or whatever. We're influenced by outside sources all of the time. And we don't want to wear something different because somebody might laugh at us. So we conform. We do that all the time with everything. If all of your friends are eating hot Cheetos, what do? Give me some hot Cheetos, right? If everybody is eating top ramen, give me some top ramen, right? Whatever everybody else is doing, we oftentimes do the same thing. And that happens here also. We get influenced by these outside sources. And so we want to cut those things off and say, this is not good for my spiritual life, man. Eliminate the danger. Let me read something to you. We're not going to have time to go. I don't want you to turn there because it will take a long time. But in Ephesians chapter 4, for those of you that take notes, Ephesians 4, verses 17 all the way down to 32. Ephesians 4, 17 through 32. I won't read all of those, but there Paul talks about cutting things off. I'll pick it up in Ephesians 4:22 where he says that you put off concerning your former conduct the old man which grows corrupt according to the deceitful lust. So cut off that old life. He says again in Ephesians 4:25, therefore, putting away lying, put it away. He goes on again to say in Ephesians chapter 4, let him who stole steal no longer. Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth. Do not grieve the Holy Spirit. Let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. So the biblical principle there is to cut that off, man. Get that out of your life. Eliminate the danger. Finally, in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 19 and 20, again, these have to do with trees. And Moses is giving them instructions and saying this. When you go and make war, and you go into somebody's land and you find trees that you can eat from, avocado, fruit, olives, whatever it might be, he says, save those trees, don't destroy them. He says, if you need to make weapons of warfare, to sieges for some other battle, then take them from trees that you do not eat from. Don't take nut trees or different things that produce fruit or whatever else. You don't want to destroy those. So he's telling them protect the natural resources. It's just a funny little way to finish the chapter, because we most oftentimes we call people tree huggers, because they want to save the trees and all these different things. And I think that some of it is nonsense, but I actually happen to really like nature, like to be outside. I like trees. I don't hug them, but I do like them. And I like forests and deserts and all those different things. And I like to go to the beach and not have to, swim out through someone's garbage. So I think it's a good thing to keep the beach clean, all those types of things. There's some balance there, but I just like verses 19 and 20 where Moses is saying, hey, pay attention. Don't just destroy everything, wipe it all out. Be mindful. Father, thank you so much for today.